to an old presentation that we haven't done for a couple of months, talking about how to make marketing accountable for sales. And that's a critical path item for a lot of businesses, because the fact of the matter is that most marketing people refuse to be accountable for sales. They're perfectly willing to take budget. They're perfectly willing to generate impressions, build websites, post ads, and be accountable for clicks or hits or traffic, sometimes even conversions. But most marketing organizations, most marketing people say, well, I don't have any control over what happens once the lead is generated. Therefore, I have no ability to be accountable for sales. Well, that's nonsense. That's an excuse. And we're going to show you how that comes about, and more importantly, how to fix that problem. So again, if you want to join in, feel free to click into the live at leadgen.com/live. And this is a workshop. So if you have specific questions that you want to have answered with respect to your own situation, your own business, and how to make marketing accountable for sales in your company, come in, we'll talk about it. I'll explain how to do it. But let's start by going through the material. All right, so this is really the problem. We see this in a lot of companies. In fact, I'm working with a company where the whole marketing team got fired because they just didn't know how to create some accountability and how to step up to the plate here. But the problem starts with management gets what it measures. Marketing departments willingly accept responsibility and budget to generate hits and clicks and views and engagement and links, responses, demos, lunch and learns, attendees, intent signals, page rank, and sometimes even appointments. But when you ask them to take responsibility for actual sales, they offer excuses. They say we don't have any control of the process in that phase of the sales cycle, or we don't have access to the prospect, or we don't have the tools that we need to control or impact the decision process. Well, those are just excuses, convenient and expensive, but that's all they are. Is they're really just excuses. Get my next slide here. Okay. So. There's an old story about John Wanamaker, who was the great retailer of the department store in Philadelphia. He says, half the money I spent on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. And that was a good excuse to double your ad spend. And he fell for it, of course. He was very successful, but that was back in the day when advertising actually worked. Today, with all the tools that you have available, it's really a lame excuse. You can know what's working. You can know very well, even on some sites and some media where your attribution is very tenuous. You may not be able to have identifiers on an email, for example. Otherwise, it messes up. You get caught in the spam bots, or not the spam bots, but the firewalls and blocks. And you can still create accountability. It's really just an excuse. Number of years ago, and a lot of people, this is another one of the scams that marketing people run, and it's the invention of the MQL, Marketing Qualified Lead. An MQL is what we used to call junk or waste in marketing. Some kind of response could be, you might think of it generally as a lead, although I'm not sure what that means these days, but a click, an impression, even an inbound. But if it doesn't go anywhere, it's waste. If it doesn't turn into an SQL, and we use a different term. We don't refer to SQLs. We refer to QSLs, or qualified sales leads. That's the only thing that really matters. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of investment. The reason why MQLs came about was because it's an artifact of the rise of some of the CRMs that didn't know how to deal with things like sales funnels and lead qualification criteria, and the absolute rampant waste and growth of techniques in marketing that really have no merit when it comes to revenue production, and things like inbound marketing and content marketing. And if you're producing any output from those that doesn't ring the cash register, or at least doesn't have a reasonable chance of ringing the cash register, it is waste, and you shouldn't be spending money generating it. Now, it's not to say that branding isn't important, but you still should be able to measure the lift, not in response rate, but in revenue associated with even something as ephemeral as branding. Interestingly, marketing people are always willing to accept more budget and responsibility to generate any new shiny object, like form fills, followers, subscribers, or even conversions. They'll make up metrics just to look like they're doing something productive, but they're very rarely willing to go on the hook for sales. Now, there are a number of ways to do that from a compensation perspective. We're not going to necessarily get into that here today, but it is helpful if marketing people do have a portion of their compensation tied to revenue production. And by that, we should add profitable revenue production. But I think when you go in the direction of skin in the game, it misses the point. Even though you'd like to think that people work towards maximizing their income or their own personal revenue, it really doesn't motivate most people, particularly the way you'd like it to. And in fact, it's more likely to lead to turnover than it's likely to lead to excellent performance, unless it is a highly accelerated compensation plan. Okay. So what does that tell you? Either their claims of not having access to the tools, prospect, or processes is a legitimate excuse, and it can't be fixed without sacrificing their marketing performance, or they're afraid of failing because they're not competent at sales. And so they'll still take the budget, and you'll get all this finger pointing between marketing and sales. But that and $2.90 gets you a ride on the subway. So, all right, so where's the solution? So first of all, you need to understand your sales cycle. This is an example of a sales cycle that we subscribe to. And I'll just take you down the primrose path here, if you will, from the things being above the funnel, or the general market above the funnel, and then your steps of the sales cycle, in this case, creating awareness, stimulating initial interest, getting in the door, qualification, uncovering needs, covering your bases, building value, meeting criteria, and closing and implementing. Those are the basic stages that every sell, whether it's B2B, B2C, B2G, you name it, those are the basic steps of the sales cycle. And on the left side of that, you can see that aligns with the Miller-Hyman strategic selling, C prospects, B prospects, and A prospects, A being closest to closing and C being new to the funnel. And that's another area where people undermine their ability to create accountability, and that is that a lot of businesses practice the theory that A prospects are your largest prospects. That is not the case. If you read Strategic Selling, again by Miller and Hyman, updated by Tad Talajian a couple of years back, the issue, what qualifies a prospect as being an A prospect is not size. It's not even probability of a successful close. It is closest to closing from the perspective of you've gone through all the steps of the sales cycle and there's nothing left to do but collect up the order if you can do that successfully. That's an A prospect. You can have an A prospect that's a $10 account. You can have an A prospect that's $1 million account. Both of them can be A prospects if the only thing left to do is close the sale. Similarly, C prospects aren't low priority by any stretch of the imagination, and we'll look at this in more detail in a moment, and they're not the smallest prospects. C prospects are simply ones that are new to the funnel, and you may have more work to do to get them to the point where you can close them. B prospects are in the middle. Okay. So another issue that comes up in finding a solution is positing that there's some handoff of a lead between marketing and sales. And, a lot of companies, and this is particularly companies that use tools like Salesforce, which I do not advocate. So let's be clear about that. If you use some of those CRM, Salesforce is probably one of the biggest offenders of this. And that is that leads basically get tossed over the wall between marketing and sales. And when it's handed off to sales, marketing doesn't have anything else to do with it. And so there's some point in that sales cycle that the lead gets handed off. A lot of companies go through these elaborate exercises of lead scoring, which frankly to me is nothing more than putting lipstick on a pig, in order to determine when a lead ought to be sent over to the sales team. That also is a very dangerous idea. It doesn't work in the vast majority of cases. It causes an enormous amount of waste, not just of time and effort, but of actual revenue. So the point that I'll make, and you'll see this in a few moments, is that there should not be a discrete point in the sales cycle where there's a handoff between marketing and sales. Rather, that point should be fluid. There are some leads that can be handed off to sales earlier, and some cases where you might want to hand it off later. And there are many cases where sales may need to hand the lead back to marketing, either to regenerate or requalify, or marketing may need to nurture a lead that sales has already had their hands into for the reason of letting time pass, or some decision criteria has to be met, or some product issue might come up. So there should never be one fixed point in the sales cycle where a lead gets handed off from marketing to sales. It should be a fluid, flexible criteria that determines where that happens, where that handoff happens. And again, the conventional wisdom, I call it conventional stupidity here, is differentiating between something called an MQL and an SQL, or leads versus opportunities. Everybody's got their favorite nonsense that they work with. And if you actually want to make money and make progress in the process, toss those ideas out. By the way, everything we talk about in this series is in our book, including this concept, and the book is available for free if you want to learn how to actually do marketing and sales effectively. Okay, so this is just an example of the header on sales. They differentiate between something called leads and accounts and opportunities, and that's a death wish. You can use Salesforce and CRMs like that in order to manage a sales cycle. They do have a lot of tools in these systems, but they're almost always used in a wrong way. And so unless you know and have a discipline around your lead management and sales management process that compensates for the power and flexibility that tools like Salesforce has, you're going to fall victim to the power of those tools that is going to undermine your sales process. We see a lot of leakage. Okay. Again, looking at the sales funnel, there are suspects that are above the funnel, and then when something gets into your sales funnel, and we'll talk about how something gets into the funnel in a moment, you then process it through first as a C account, a B prospect, then an A prospect, and then it becomes a customer. Okay. All right. So I need to introduce, in order to create accountability, we have to understand a concept called the expected value. And there really is no ability to create an accurate sales forecast without understanding the expected value concept. Now, why is a sales forecast important? Well, for one thing, it's important for budgeting. Whether it's December now and companies are looking to set budgets for next year, and one of the inputs to that budget, of course, is what is the sales they expect to get during the course of the year. That's just the sales forecast, right? If you're assigning territories, you have a certain revenue expectation from that territory. Or if you're any kind of, at whatever level you're managing the business, you could do an acquisition. You have an expectation of what the revenue flow is going to be from that business. Right down to your own personal, if you're a salesperson, you have an idea of what your sales are going to be, or what you have to do to make that number, and what your compensation is going to be. So the idea of a sales forecast is critical to managing your business, your sales, and your marketing program, regardless of what level you're operating at, the individual salesperson, the sales team, your company, or a larger organization. All right, so what's a sales forecast? A sales forecast is nothing more than the expectation of revenues, month by month, week by week, whatever you want to choose. And you put your forecast against that, and you make investments in the business based on your expectation. It turns out that there is a very specific methodology for creating that forecast. And I'm going to bring this back to funnel back down to earth in a couple of minutes. But what I'm starting today from looking at this as a sales forecast issue, and you can see if you have close dates in some spreadsheet that contains all of your prospects, and you've got King Manufacturing here that has the potential of delivering $100,000. You have PTG has a potential of delivering $140,000, and so on. Arlen, Tiger, and Axel. These have a potential revenue in this column. But the reality is that not every one of these prospects is expected to close. You're not going to have a 100% close rate. If you do, great. Then your expected value is the same as your potential revenue. There's a probability that you can usually assign to any given prospect at any given time. If you multiply the potential revenue times the probability that it's going to close, you come up with an expected value. Now, that expected value may seem like a made-up number, but it's really very much the reality of what's going on in your business. It's much more accurate of predicted revenues, particularly in aggregate, as you can see, than the potential revenue is. So in other words, if this is what's in your funnel, got 6, 7, 8 prospects in your funnel that have the potential of producing $660,000, if you consider the realistic probabilities that these are going to actually close, that revenue forecast is probably closer to $280,000. And so that's what we mean by an expected value. If you spread the close dates out month by month, you now have a month by month forecast. And that's how expected value works. It enables you to predict what your revenues are going to be. But it lets you do one other thing in this context that's really important. And that is it enables you to prioritize your work. Because you're not going to wake up one day, look at this and say, okay, fine, I don't have to do anything to generate $283,000 worth of revenue. The fact is, you've got some period of time to increase these probabilities from whatever they are, 30, 20, 50%, to 100%. You are not going to be successful every time, but when you're planning your activities, whether it's sales activities or marketing activities, you have to look at what you want to do is look at the potential of that activity with any given prospect to increase the probability of that prospect, increasing its probability of a successful close. So let's take a look. Here's King Manufacturing. And let's say right now, December, it has a 30% probability of closing. And maybe the only thing that we need to do in order to bump that up to maybe 90% is take the prospect out for a game of golf. We have to do some customer golf and get to know them personally. And all of a sudden, I think that probability will go from 30% to 90%. It's easy to visualize that round of golf that might cost a couple of $100, if you let the prospect win, has a return on investment of, say, 30% to 90%, so 60%, $60,000 for increased in expected value. So expected value goes from $100,000 to $90,000 for a $200 investment in a round of golf. That's a good return on a couple of $100 and 4 hours of your time. And you could look at any other activity, whether it's making a presentation or putting a proposal together or making contact with other decision influencers. Every one of those activities should have the potential of increasing the probability that deal will close. And so when we look at the sales funnel, when you consider the probability of prospect closing successfully, you don't own the expected value isn't static. Your sales forecast isn't static. It's subject to being impacted by you doing specific activities designed to increase the probability that prospect or all the prospects will close successfully. And so we need to introduce this expected value concept. And this is not uncommon in the sales world. We're going to talk about the marketing implications in a moment. But a lot of sales teams use the expected value concept in order to manage their territories, manage the team forecast, and so on. And this, of course, as you can see on the left, is aligned with the strategic selling concept. So, something is a C prospect, you do a bunch of things, becomes a B prospect, you do a bunch more things, it becomes an A prospect, and hopefully it'll close. The other thing to keep in mind for those of you who are familiar with it, it is perfectly possible to have an A prospect with a 25% probability of closing successfully. And if you aren't familiar with why that happens, it means they're going to buy something. It's just not from you, right? So they might be an A prospect, but you may have to throw a Hail Mary pass to get that deal, to get it from 25% to 100%. Okay, so one of the benefits of this approach is that it gives you a much more realistic forecast. I alluded to that in a moment. If you go according to potential forecast, obviously, and this is where I spread the numbers out month by month based on the expected close date, April looks like 225,000, 240, 165 in June, but a more realistic forecast is 126, 58, and 99. So if your bogey is, say, $200,000 a month, you could delude yourself into thinking you're going to make it by by ignoring the probabilities and living on a potential forecast, or you can be realistic and say, hey, you know what? I'm at 126. I got to make up $74,000, so I better do something. Okay, so your forecast accuracy goes up, and it also helps you prioritize your work in a more meaningful way. All right, so where are we now? All right, so I talked about prioritization. You're really, when you get up in the morning and you sit down at your sales job, the question that you should be asking is, what do I have to do to increase the probability of a successful close? And that's what we're talking about here. An activity like taking the prospect out for golf, or sending a sample, or talking to another decision maker, or making a presentation, or doing lunch and learn, or whatever it is, doing a quote, are activities and designed to give you a return on your investment of time. And the way that's measured is in what's the incremental value in terms of the expected value of that potential deal to you of investing in that activity. That's day-to-day sales management. Okay. Another thing we want to talk about, and then again, we're going to swing back and talk about the marketing component of this, is this comes out of spin selling, which the author of spin selling, Neil Rackham, had a great concept called the advance. We use a concept called the concrete step, which is, if you're doing, when it comes to activities designed to increase those probabilities, it's important that the activity result in the prospect doing something. If you do all the work, you're not bumping the probability. So, for example, if you say to a prospect, fine, I'll call you next week, and you think that's going to bump your probability from 10% to 25%, you're kidding yourself. On the other hand, if you can get the prospect to do something when you call, so if you say to the prospect, I'll call you next week, can you have your requirements document available for me when I call next week? If he actually does that, that is a concrete step that took him time, effort, and potentially money to do for you. And if he actually does it, then that is proof, or at least evidence, that he's invested in your sales process, and you've made a legitimate increase in the probability that that will close successfully. May not be everything you need to do, but when you think about what you're doing in order to get the probability to go up, it shouldn't only be something that you do. It should be something that costs the prospect time, effort, or money in order to increase that probability, in order to legitimize that step. Okie doke. All right. So we talked about work prioritization, and here you can see concrete steps. Meeting with a boss. So you're asking the prospect to get your boss involved, or send you specs, or get them to sole source you, or have your prospect make an internal presentation of your offering, send you a contract, commit the budget, whatever it is. If you're not getting the prospect to do something, then you can't legitimately say that you're increasing the probability of closing. Now, this version of it, you'll notice I have P1 and P2 here. So initially you have a revenue potential, and you can think, and there are people who use their funnels this way, that if I do nothing, I have a 30% probability, we're looking at King Manufacturing here, I have a 30% probability of that prospect closing successfully. But if I can convince the prospect to get me a meeting with their boss, I think that'll bump the probability from 30% to 50%. Obviously, the incremental value of getting the prospect to do that is $20,000. That is a good use of your time. Okay. Similarly with PTG, I've got a $140,000 prospect right now with a 20% probability of closing successfully. So it's worth in my funnel $28,000. But if I can get the prospect to spec my product or give me the specs for his purchase in this case, I can bump that from 20% to 30% because he's gotten I've gotten him to get up off his butt, dig out the specs, and send it to me. Okay, he's invested in the process. So that's worth an incremental $14,000. So you really can put a dollar value on everything you do as a salesperson when you're using funnel management in this way. That's a lot of fun. Now, obviously, you always want to ask the question, what do I have to do to increase the probability of successful close? And when you look at the activities that are available to you, this is a great way to prioritize your work. If you look at that right-hand column, you can see pretty clearly that 2 or 3 of these activities have the greatest impact, incremental benefit to this funnel. One is getting getting the prospect to disqualify your competitions, worth $37,500. Getting the prospect to write up the contract, in your favor, is worth $30,000, and getting the sole source is $36,000. So I'd rather do that than worry about an executive pitch. Okay, make sure we're in the right place. Okay. So now we get to how does marketing fit into this? And if you think about time management in the field sales arena, there are just so many hours in the day that field salespeople have, and it could be retail, it could be anybody who's at the sales end of things as opposed to marketing. There's some triage that goes on in that funnel. You don't have time to do every activity, okay? And so one of the things that marketing can do is there's oftentimes when marketing can do some of those activities, even though the lead may have been turned over to marketing, and that's passing the lead back. Marketing should do those things because anytime marketing can do something from sitting back at headquarters to help advance a lead and take the burden off the salesperson so that they have more time to do other higher priority items, that is a good use of resource. And so the first concept we want to get into this system in order to create accountability in marketing is the idea of flexible lead ownership. That means sometimes marketing may have the lead, sales may get it, and they may give it back to marketing. And leads can go back and forth multiple times depending on your business circumstances and what your lead management process is. So no hard and fast rule, in spite of what Salesforce tells you, in spite of what all these platforms will tell you. There's no hard and fast rule that says that marketing can't take leads back, not just to requalify them, which is conventional, but to advance the sell cycle. Second issue, the issue about MQLs is that they rarely have a revenue associated with them. They're just a warm body. The qualification criteria for an MQL is often lacking a potential revenue and a probability of close. And that's where the biggest loss of accountability is. If a lead doesn't have a potential revenue and a probability of closing successfully, even if those numbers are small, they should not go in the funnel. And marketing has to be responsible for assigning that. Now, it can bounce all over the map. It can be wrong. In fact, it's guaranteed to be wrong. But marketing can't be invested in the process if they don't even have a metric in the game. Okay? So when marketing hands a lead off to sales, they should assign a potential revenue and a probability of close. It's unusual for marketing to assign a potential close date because they may or may not have a sense of what the order cycle is or the buy cycle is, but there should be, if either based on actual interaction with the prospect or the way the lead was generated, some understanding of what the potential revenue is and what the probability of close is. Only then should the lead ever get into the sales funnel. If you can't do that, keep it in your marketing basket, smoke it. It doesn't matter. It's not an asset to the business, and it simply doesn't matter. Second issue in terms of creating accountability for marketing is, as I said a moment ago, there's no fixed ownership of a lead or an opportunity. A lead can go back and forth from marketing to sales and back again, and it can happen multiple times a month. It can happen with multiple leads, and there's no hard and fast rule as to how long it has to sit in one department or the other. If we're both on the same team, if marketing and sales are both measured on the same metric, then ownership is something that should be shared. And so that last comment gets to part of marketing's compensation should be based on revenue. Right? If it isn't based on revenue, then they shouldn't be getting paid. It's that simple. Now, the other thing that I like to look at when we work with a company is that forecast accuracy. A lot of times the forecast accuracy is equivalent to managing by, the old concept of the beatings will stop when morale improves. But forecast accuracy is really a reflection of how effectively you manage your territory. And when marketing is responsible for forecast accuracy, it forces them to engage with these leads farther down the sales cycle. So if marketing issues a forecast and it's missed, okay, it's because they don't know what's going on in the sales cycle, and they should be punished for that. If, on the other hand, they have a regular updated version of the forecast and it's accurate, and you can pick your plus or minus on it, 5%, 10%, doesn't matter, right? But you should be measured not just on revenue production, but on forecast accuracy. Now, that's more appropriate for marketing than it is for sales. It's not really helpful for salespeople to have accurate forecasts. They usually get beaten over the head just for not making their numbers. But it's actually a good way to manage a salesperson, because if you're a sales manager, and this is more about marketing than sales, if you're a sales manager and you have a salesperson that consistently misrepresents what they're going to deliver, and that could be, they could highball it or lowball it. A lot of guys, it depends on their personality. Some guys will lowball and they'll come in and look like a hero. And meantime, you've been sitting there thinking you're not going to make your number as a team. That's not helpful either. So forecast accuracy is really important. Okay. Anyway, so let's look at what that flexible lead ownership looks like. And over here in the columns with red on them, you have BOM and EOM, and what that means is beginning of month and end of month. Now, I'm using month as kind of an example of a time frame. So we're assuming that salespeople have a monthly quota to hit, and marketing people are sitting around with nothing else to do. The former assumption is probably accurate. The latter is probably accurate too. Anyway, at the beginning of the month, marketing may be working with C prospects. They may be doing qualification. They may make a few phone calls. They may, be doing 90% of their activities on lead generation or promotion or branding or whatever it is, right? And the salespeople, because they have a whole month to work and to make their number, let's say they got a number that they got to hit at the end of the month, they're more than happy to work on all their B prospects and their A prospects. And that's great. But now you get to the end of the month and they got to get stuff closed. And they don't have to have time to play golf with the president of Axel Group in order to bump that probability from, the expected value from $42,000 to $120,000. Get it from 35 to 100%. He ain't going to make it. Maybe there's no time slots on the golf course, whatever it is. If there's no time for the salespeople to do those activities, then marketing should take ownership of those prospects. And to the degree that marketing can engage in some of those activities, that is likely to have a very positive effect on the probability that those deals are going to close, maybe not in that month, but absolutely in the next month. Now, let's look at that from a practical perspective. What normally happens is salespeople are going to neglect, in this case, prospects like Arlen, Round, and Axel Group, the 3B prospects, the last week of the month, maybe the last 2 weeks of the month. They're going to neglect them, guaranteed, because all they want to do is they want to make their numbers, so they're going to do everything they can to get HMG closed and Tiger closed, because that's the only ones that they can close in that kind of time frame. They are simply not going to work on those B prospects. And so what happens is they close those 2 A prospects. Maybe they get lucky, maybe they don't. Looks like they'll get HMG but not Tiger, right? So they work on those prospects, and now you get into the first week of the next month, and Arlen, Round, and Axel have fallen back to C's, or their probability of closing has been cut in half because some activity wasn't done that, had it been done, they'd at least have stayed even with where they were as far as probability of closing, and maybe even advanced a little bit. And that is leakage from the funnel that happens all the time. I can tell you from experience that probably accounts for 50% of the funnel loss, 50% of the cases that sales teams lose opportunity because they're rushing to make their number at the end of the month. Now, what do a lot of salespeople do? A lot of sales teams figure, if I got enough months left in the year, I'll make it up then. There isn't a salesperson alive who hasn't thought that in January, February, and March, right? And they may be able to do it, right? But it's not necessary, and it leaves a lot of money on the table. And of course, you get into the third and fourth quarter, and that no longer becomes an option. And then you miss your number, and now you're looking for a new job. And the marketing people are sitting there saying, hey, I didn't drop the ball on these. I gave them the leads. They went into the funnel. No, you did drop the ball, because if there's activities that you could have done, even though you had already given the lead to sales, if there are activities that you could have done that could have advanced that sales cycle, it is your fault. And so when you design a marketing program that is accountable for sales, it's the prospects that are being neglected because the salespeople have prioritized deals that are going to close in their relevant time frame. You have to work on those prospects. And that's flexible lead ownership, and it's where all this comes together in terms of expected value, in terms of funnel management, and of course, in terms of making your forecast. And any team can easily increase their sales by 30 to 50% by implementing this kind of accountability. It only happens if marketing participates in the funnel management process. And if you need help, we can show you how to do it. We consult on this stuff all the time. Okay. Implementation issues. I mentioned the concrete step or advances. You need to differentiate between nice noises and concrete steps. If you're sending people something and they're letting you call them back, you're not making progress. You're just kidding yourself into thinking that you're making progress. Time management. This funnel management is all about time management, and that goes for both marketing people and salespeople. And finally, marketing needs to participate in territory management. If they are not participating in territory management, if they don't think that it impacts them, then you are mismanaging the process. It's that simple. And I'm not just talking about if you have a team on the phones. I'm talking about staff marketers that do things like social media marketing or advertising or network marketing or networking or whatever it is. Okay. Everybody has to be responsible for that revenue forecast. And it isn't hard. It's not just sitting there and saying, okay, I feel bad, we're not going to make our number. It's taking work items. And again, I'll go back here for a second. What are the work items? Here they are. List them out. What are the concrete steps that need to be need to take place in order to move that sales cycle forward. And any salesperson that doesn't know what those steps are, any salesperson that doesn't know what work item they need to do in order to increase the probability that that prospect is going to close successfully, should not be getting paid. So that's the rant for today. All right. If you have any questions, I'll sit here for a minute or two. And if anybody wants to click in, go to leadgen.com/live, LIVE.